Всем здравствуйте! Вы на канале Философия, и сегодня у нас будет стрим с Кейном Бейкером. Мне кажется, вы все его знаете. И наконец-то он появился и на русском сегменте Ютуба. Сегодня мы поговорим на разные темы: метаэтика, метафилософия, метафизика и много других топиков. Говорить мы будем на английском, субтитры будут доступны позднее. И у вас будет возможность задать свой вопрос, который я переведу на английский в течение нашей дискуссии. Okay. The introduction is done. Now we can discuss different philosophical topics. Firstly, I think you can introduce yourself, talk about your fields of philosophical study and such.
Okay, yeah, so I don't know, I'm never very good at introducing myself, but, well, I'm Kane Baker. I'm currently doing a philosophy PhD, coming towards the end of it now. I guess if people know about me, they'll know about me through my YouTube channel. Yeah, so my field of interest, I focus mainly on philosophy of science. I'm particularly interested in the scientific realism, anti-realism debate, and I suppose epistemology in general. Also quite interested in meta-ethics. I guess, you know, pretty much any area of contemporary analytic philosophy is at least somewhat interesting to me, but I think those are the areas that I tend to focus on the most at the moment. So yeah, there you go. That's the introduction to me.
Okay. I think we can start with questions. So the first question I want to ask is kind of very basic, but what is philosophy in your opinion?
Oh man, you said that was a basic question, but that feels like it's not a basic question at all.
Yeah.
That's a really tough question. You know, I don't know if philosophy really is a kind of unified field, right? I often feel as though we give the name philosophy to just a whole bunch of questions and problems that aren't dealt with by other subjects, or that we maybe don't yet know how to deal with in other subjects. And certainly when you look at like the history of philosophy, it is the case that there were a lot of questions that were once part of philosophy that then broke off as we figured out how to answer them in more clear ways, you know. So philosophers used to talk about things like the nature of space and time, and I guess they still do, but actually a lot of those problems have now moved into physics. Questions about the nature of the mind, a lot of those have broken off into psychology, and perhaps that kind of thing will continue into the future. I suppose I tend to see philosophy as being, I mean, inquiry into the nature of things, into the nature of the world, but in a way that is non-empirical, like non-experimental. Like philosophers will tend to use more conceptual tools, thought experiments, rather than performing experiments in the world. Of course, that's not a strict distinction, because actually there are some philosophers who will perform empirical experiments, and there are some scientists who will engage in thought experiments and so on. But yeah, I find it, I can't really define the subject more clearly than that. And I mean, to me, it doesn't really matter, you know. I mean, for me, whenever I'm asked the question of like, oh well, is this philosophy? I think really the question should be, is this an interesting question? And if it happens to be dealt with by philosophers, then I guess you can call it philosophy. But that's about as much as I can say on that point.
Well, I think the right definition of philosophy, and also you kind of talked about it, is the discipline that that tries to answer the fundamental questions of the nature of things in our world. Yeah, I think that well, that is the definition that I use, and I think it is more relevant and kind of actually is what you talked about.
Well, so there is a nice quote by Wilfrid Sellers where he says that philosophy is the study of how things in the broadest sense of the term hang together in the broadest sense of the term. I suppose that if we're framing it in terms of the study of the fundamental nature of things in the world, my general philosophical perspective is I'm a pretty hardcore empiricist, and I'm quite skeptical of metaphysical theorizing. I don't think that we have any access to what the fundamental nature of things is like. So I don't know if that way of thinking about philosophy is one that I would. I don't think that really that's one that I would be inclined to agree with for that reason.
Right. Well, I don't know. I think it is kind of intuitive. It is based on our intuition of what fundamental questions are. Yeah. Well, the next question is, okay, so maybe philosophy itself is undefinable, but we know about branches of philosophy, and we can certainly say what their subject of study is. And so, there are a lot of things that people claim are overrated in our world, like sex is overrated, or maybe education is overrated. And what fields of philosophical study, what branches of philosophy do you think are unreasonably overrated, or on the contrary, underrated?
Well, I suppose it depends on what you mean by overrated. There are certain branches of philosophy that I think are, let's say, misguided in their basic aims, but I tend to have the attitude that we should, let 1,000 flowers bloom. I think that it's to the benefit of philosophy that we have lots of different people holding very, very different views and coming at things using very different methods. I tend to think of, philosophy is as a general tradition, right? It doesn't tend to achieve consensus on any particular issues. I mean, sometimes you do find philosophers forming broad consensuses. I mean, I suppose that there's a general consensus in favor of like physicalism or materialism these days. But I mean, like it's often the case that that's more a product of just like the latest intellectual fashion. I mean, I don't think there's any reason to expect that the current consensus in favor of physicalism will continue indefinitely. So philosophers disagree on everything, and I think that if there is any such thing as philosophical progress, it probably consists more in exploring lots of different views and figuring out the relations between those views and exploring conceptual space, let's say, rather than coming down on, all right, this is the way things are, and we've all got a consensus on this particular way of looking at things. So it's a bit difficult to say what areas are overrated, just for that reason, because actually I'm in favor of encouraging even approaches to philosophy that I find are perhaps, as I say, misguided. That's okay. I mean, look, I guess that as I've mentioned, I'm skeptical of metaphysics. Metaphysics, in the sense of the attempt to figure out like the fundamental structure and nature of reality. I just don't think that we have access to that information, and I think that metaphysics as a general discipline is misguided. Is it overrated? Well, to be honest, I really enjoy it, and I enjoy exploring it. I like engaging with metaphysical texts just as much as any other philosopher. So I don't know if I would say it's overrated. I'm not sure. So I guess I'm not sure what the answer is to that question. Yeah. I mean, there are areas that I'm not interested in, but again, that's just like a personal taste.
Yeah, a few days ago you made a big contribution in philosophy of of religion.
Did I?
And so, yeah, and yeah, I think that the problem with metaphysics is that we just don't know. We don't know physics enough to talk about metaphysics. But I think we will come to metaphysics later in our discussion. Well, yeah, you have a lot of nihilistic positions. Or borderline nihilistic, as I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but aren't they just boring? Don't you think that it's? Don't you think that maybe moral anti-realism is boring, or your metaphysical positions?
I don't know. I suppose some people find them boring. I can't really do much about that. I mean, different people will have different tastes. If I'm understanding you correctly, I mean, so I mean, yeah. If there are some people who just find philosophy in general boring. I mean, if you speak to my dad, he would find philosophy as a whole utterly uninteresting. So. Yeah, I'm not really sure how to respond to that, other than, I mean, I would say that just because a position is boring doesn't mean that it's wrong, right? I could be right about this, even though it's
true.
not interesting to people.
Yeah, but the world where nothing exists is so dull. I think it's just I don't know. For me, it's very it's full of negative emotions when I think that nothing exists, or even something doesn't, which I tend to believe exists. Well, yeah. So even if you don't like metaphysics, what is your ontological position, if there is one?
So I yeah. So like I mentioned empiricism. So
yeah.
I don't really see this as so much an ontological position, but it informs the way that I think about ontological questions. So empiricism, as it's traditionally understood, I guess that you know, if you sort of look at the kind of textbook definition of empiricism, it might be something like, you know, all of our concepts are derived from sense experience, you know, or you know, all our ideas derived from sense experience, something like that. You know, this kind of concept empiricism, and that's, I mean, that was a very powerful tool to a lot of philosophers who endorsed it, because, you know, it allowed them to kind of break down concepts, and it allowed them to sort of criticize a lot of philosophical assumptions that others had made. I think that way of approaching it, as important as it was historically, is not so useful these days. I mean, mainly because that's just like a psychological hypothesis, you know, about the nature of the mind. And also, if you endorse the idea that, you know, all concepts are derived from sense experience, it looks like you're going to have problems justifying ampliative inferences. So inferences from what we currently observe and experience to things that are unobserved. And we kind of need to make those sorts of inferences because, you know, we need to make predictions about the future and so on. So when I say I'm an empiricist, I mean it in the sense of what's sometimes called stance empiricism. So the idea is that broad philosophical positions should be thought of not so much as claims that can be evaluated as being true or false, but as sort of attitudes or commitments. And then empiricism involves a commitment to viewing science as a kind of paradigm of rational inquiry. It involves accepting disagreement on any given factual question. It involves a dissatisfaction with attempts to explain the success of a particular discourse by postulating entities which that discourse truly describes. So explanation by postulation. And so this perhaps connects to, you know, what you were saying about the kind of nihilistic positions I hold. You know, a lot of people will look at, say, moral discourse, moral judgments, as like, in order to explain the success of those things, or in order to explain how that works, we need to postulate a realm of moral values or moral properties or moral facts of which moral judgments may be true or false. And empiricism, as a stance, kind of resists that. It says, like, no, we you know, we should favor like other ways of accounting for the success of particular institutions, rather than by postulating sort of things existing in the world. So when you say, you know, my ontological views, well, generally I'm going to be agnostic about those questions. I think that there are lots of things in the world, you know, there are people and chairs and cars and mountains and all of the, you know, common sense things that we all accept exist. I'm perfectly happy to say they exist. But in terms of, you know, what are they like on a sort of fundamental level? What is their fundamental nature or structure? I don't know. Are there, you know, things beyond what we experience? Are there things that, you know, like moral value, or, you know, God or whatever? Again, I won't go in for any of that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I had a question about universals, if it is called that way in English. I don't know, but I think I understand that you're agnostic about it too. Yeah. We've touched on moral realism and moral anti-realism. So in your recent video, you talked about you criticized moral realism and there was an argument about the inconsistency of morality. I think that we can solve the problem of inconsistency the other way. Let's say that there is no distinction between consequentialism and deontology, for example, and all of our moral reasoning is consequentialistic. For example, if we take deontology, when we use categorical imperative, we still analyze consequences, but of our actions projected on everyone. Or if we talk about the virtue theory, it is also based on consequences, but the consequences of having a certain character trait. So I don't know if you how could you react to that position?
Yeah, well, when it is worth pointing out, the argument I gave in that video was certainly not one that I think is, it's not one that I would put forward as being rationally compelling. It was more just a sort of suggestion, right? Like, I think that anybody who's a moral realist has about 100 different ways that they can respond to that argument. And I guess the way that I was looking at it was more, okay, well, there's at least kind of on the face of it, that there's something that it seems like it might be inconsistent, right? There's a seeming inconsistency here. If you're a moral realist, then you're going to have to figure out a way of resolving that inconsistency. But it's also possible to react to this by just kind of accepting the inconsistency. Like somebody who is more inclined already towards anti-realism would naturally just look at this and say, well, okay then. So it turns out morality is inconsistent. Well, that's more grist for my mill. Now, the idea that you've got there, I guess the suggestion seems to be, well, look, ultimately, all of our reasoning really is consequentialist. And maybe the reason why we think in deontological terms, or the reason why we think in terms of, say, virtue ethics, like ultimately the rules that we adopt or the virtues that we attribute to people are based on the good consequences of those rules or those virtues.
Yeah, it all comes down to consequentialism, essentially. And there is no inconsistency because of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one way of resolving the tension. It seems so. I guess one way to look at it, at least that sort of makes sense to me, is to say something like, well, when we think in terms of deontological rules or in terms of virtues, that's just a sort of useful heuristic. It's ultimately in our everyday life, we sometimes just have to react to things quickly, and so we don't have time to work out all of the consequences. And of course, we are all of us are cognitively limited, so it's very difficult to figure out what all of the consequences of any given action might be. So it makes sense that we have just these sort of simple rules that we can easily apply that generally work. But ultimately, right, what's morally right is to maximize the best consequences. Our rules will sometimes make us go wrong, but that's the best we can do, practically speaking. Yeah, I mean that seems like a perfectly acceptable position to me. I mean, my only point to this would be, look, I like there are going to be a lot of people who are deontologists or virtue ethicists who will say, like, no, that's not how things work, right? So I don't really feel any need to enter into those debates. I can just sort of point out, well, philosophers haven't actually achieved any consensus that this is the right way of thinking about things, and I don't see any reason to predict that they will achieve a consensus in the future. So I'm just going to assume I can carry on assuming that things are inconsistent. But like I say, if you're coming at it from a different perspective, then that is a perfectly reasonable take on the matter.
Okay.
which is why when I gave that argument, I was very tentative about it. I didn't say, this is the way things are. It was just a suggestion.
Yeah, but I think this argument is actually it is actually very strong, and your answer to it is yeah, it's very strong. Well, it is also a basic question, but from the start, do you consider yourself a theorist of error? Yeah, you tend to have a position of tend to have a position of theory of error in metaethics.
So yeah. So this is just the view that moral claims so they should be viewed as beliefs that can be evaluated as being true or false, but they're just all false because there are no moral properties. So yeah, I'm inclined to that position. So I'm very, very much an anti-realist about morality, but whether we say that moral claims are all false, or whether we say that they're just not the sorts of things that can be true or false, actually that's not particularly important to me. But right now, I'd be inclined towards an error theory. I'd be inclined to say that when we make moral claims, that's kind of like when we talk about, say, witches, right? So saying that Verity is a witch, well, that's just false because there are no witches. Saying that slavery is wrong, that's just false. And slavery is good is also just false. Not endorsing slavery. I personally dislike slavery very much.
No one will understand you on this stream. So on this live stream, so you can say whatever you want. Well,
Okay,
but, it is I have a kind of basic question, and I think that in your lecture you answered it, but I couldn't remember it. So if all of our moral statements are false, then how can we make moral decisions or justified moral decisions? We can't make them, or
so justified moral decisions, I'm not sure that I would say we can do that, but it depends on what you mean by justified. Now, the broader question of how do we make moral decisions? So okay, this is maybe a good example of the kind of perspective I was talking about earlier, where as an empiricist, somebody who's who comes at this from a different sort of philosophical perspective might look at our practice of engaging in moral arguments and making moral decisions, and they'll say, there needs to be some sort of fact that we can get right or wrong, right? So then they're going to postulate a realm of facts that our moral judgments can be true or false of. Right now, an empiricist, I'm coming at this, I'm going to say, I don't think that really helps explain the discourse. I think actually we can give a perfectly reasonable explanation of our moral practices without thinking of morality as getting at facts in the world, or as being true or false of facts in the world. So the way that we come to moral positions or make moral decisions, part of this is just going to be a product of a well, our sort of evolutionary history, let's say, that's going to have some sort of influence on us. Humans are a social species. You know, part of that is that we have to come up with rules that like guide people's behavior. We need to, like, it is useful for all of us to have certain conventions with respect to things like property, or with respect to things like kind of how we treat other people. So, you know, if I want something, right, I don't just go and take it from somebody because somebody else might do the same thing to me, right? So, you know, we have to kind of come up with rules to regulate behavior, to promote social cooperation. That makes us all better off. So part of this is when we're engaging in moral debates, we can think of it from that point of view. Another thing is just that people will have like immediate intuitions. So when you see, for instance, somebody being enslaved, you're just going to react negatively to it. It will perhaps provoke anger, or it will provoke sympathy for the person who is the victim. And as long as we all share a reasonable number of our values, and we do happen to share certain basic values, you know, we can sort of work out what sort of rules would best promote our values. So there's no need, I don't think, to postulate a realm of moral facts. There's no need to suppose that moral judgments are true. You know, I think we can account for moral decision making perfectly well by I guess just looking at like the psychology of humans, right? So yeah, I think that's the answer I would give to that.
Yeah, right. But I also have a question. It's more like a theoretical one. But what is the main difference between intuitivism and individual subjectivism? Because for me, it seems like they are almost the same.
I'm not sure what that distinction is. What is this in reference to? Is this? Can you just explain a bit more what?
Well, there are a lot of moral theories, and there is the one that morals are based on our intuition, and the right moral decisions are the ones that seem more intuitive. I can't pronounce this word. Intuitively right. And there is a subjective individualism. The thing that well, I know what is. I think you know what individual subjectivism.
So is this a view that like moral claims would be true or false just relative to like the individual? So if I feel that, you know, so that like slavery is wrong for me because I feel that slavery is wrong. In the case of what I think a lot of philosophers will say about this is that actually intuitions, how should I put this? So the way that we talk about intuitions really depends on our broader philosophical theory or metaethical theory, because there are a lot of moral realists who would consider themselves to be intuitionists. But what they would say is that intuition, and by intuition, what I mean here are sort of pre-reflective, pre-theoretical kind of gut reactions, almost like you say when you know if you have like a case like the trolley case where, you know, one person's on a track and then there's 5 people on a track and you're asked what should you do, you know, should you switch the track? Well, you're going to have like an immediate reaction to that, or at least most people will. Most people will think yes, of course you should switch, and others will think no, you shouldn't. But like those are just the intuitive reactions. So what a lot of philosophers will say is, well, intuition is actually just as reliable a source of information about the world as is perception. There's no reason why we should be any more skeptical of our intellectual seemings as we should be of perceptual seemings. So, why do I believe that there is a cup in front of me? Well, because perceptually, right, it seems to me that there's a cup in front of me, and I have no particular reason to doubt that perceptual seeming. Similarly, why do we think it's a fact that slavery is wrong? Well, because it seems that slavery is wrong. Like, intellectually, it seems that slavery is wrong, and we have no particular reason to doubt that. So actually, you can endorse reliance on intuition even as a moral realist, and it's not really clear, like, if you're skeptical of intuition, it's not really clear like what else you can use to determine what moral theory you accept. Like, if you just get rid of all your moral intuitions, I'm not sure how you then go about constructing a moral theory. There are I guess some ways that you can proceed, but it seems pretty clear that most people, when they're trying to figure out what they morally ought to do, will appeal to intuitions at some level. So I don't think that a kind of intuitionist methodology commits you to individual subjectivism. No. Now, of course, I'm personally quite skeptical that intuitions do, track the facts, but that's fine because I'm not a moral realist, so that's no problem for me.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, thank you for clearing that question for me. Well, there is a prehistoric. Well, also talking about morals, if my education is that I'm a lawyer, and that question really stood out to me. If there is no if we are not moral realists, then how can we build the theory of law? How can we make laws if we aren't basing our position on morals? If you, of course, I'm sorry for interrupting you. If you, of course, accept that laws come from morals. Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know. I don't know exactly what the challenge here is. It seems to me that even if you are a moral realist, you're still going to have to account for the fact that there are laws which fail to track the moral facts, right? So let's just grant moral realism, right? Let's suppose there are moral facts. Well, presumably you're still going to want to say, hey, some of these laws, right, are morally wrong. You're not going to say that like whatever is like legal just is morally right, and whatever is illegal is morally wrong, right? There are presumably going to be laws somewhere in the world that you disagree with, or presumably there will be places in which there are things which are legal but that you evaluate as being morally wrong. So I mean, from a realist point of view, then, right, you still have a whole bunch of laws which fail to track the moral facts. Now, an anti-realist is just going to say, okay, there are no moral facts, so that's like extend the same idea to like law in general, right? So I'm a little bit, yeah. I guess I'm not sure where the challenge is exactly. I mean,
Well,
it is going to be the case that we can't. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, go. All right. But when we discuss law and when we say, "Oh, that this law is bad," I think it is not just to have this law in our maybe like civil code or something. How can we judge laws? How can we judge laws if we have no moral background? For example, as a moral realist, I think that the right to have demonstrations is a basic right for me, because because in my moral theory, I think that freedom of speech is a basic rule that everyone, and especially government, should take into account. And like, we can't say that. And for me, I think that if we discuss laws, we can't say that we can't judge laws, and while not being basing our position on morals, on morality.
Okay, yeah. So I think that you will, if you're judging a law, then yeah, you're probably going to be judging it from a moral point of view. I mean, certainly my moral anti-realism doesn't involve a commitment to the idea that we should just stop making moral evaluations. You know, I think morality is a very useful tool. So, you know, I'm quite happy to make moral judgments and engage in moral argument, and I'm fine with other people doing that as well. Now, if we think about something like, you know, okay, take your example, the right to protest. So, okay, how might we go about justifying that? Well, you know, I think that a moral anti-realist would give very similar arguments that a moral realist would. So, for example, we could say, well, look, we all want to sort of have a society which is, you know, prosperous and peaceful, and in which, like, you know, all individuals. I mean, so let's say we take a kind of utilitarian kind of approach, and we're sort of just looking at trying to, you know, maximize happiness for the greatest number of people. You as a moral anti-realist, right, you can say, you know, this is something that I want, and this is also something that pretty much everybody else wants, right? Like, the vast majority of people would like to live in a society in which everybody is happy and peaceful and prosperous. And then you could argue that having a democratic system in which people are able to, you know, protest their government and able to, you know, express themselves freely is conducive to achieving that kind of society, or is more conducive to it than is, you know, authoritarianism. And, you know, there are other, like, arguments you might give. You might just sort of appeal to, I guess, people's self-interest. You might say, well, look, you may well agree with what the government is doing now, right? But maybe the government will start doing things you disagree with in the future, in which case it will be in your self-interest to protest that. So, you know, actually, the only people that really benefit from preventing protests, right, are the very, very few people who are in power. The vast majority of us benefit from being able to express ourselves. So just from the point of view of your own self-interest, it's worth allowing protests. So, you know, that's, and I think that's the kind of way in which we will reason about these things, whether or not we are realists or anti-realists. I mean, a realist will add the idea that it is a fact that the right to protest is, morally required. But in terms of the actual like argument, the reasons that you might give to try to persuade someone to that view, I think that realists and anti-realists can say very similar things. So I think that's the kind of line I would take in response to that.
Yeah, all right. That's reasonable. We have a few questions from different people. Some of them are quite ridiculous, but nevertheless, the first one is...
That's okay. I'm fine with any questions.
Okay. The first is, do you know any Russian philosophers? And do we study do Britain universities study Russian literature or philosophy in there?
Yeah, and so I don't know much about the Russian philosophical tradition.
It's very continental, so I don't think that you could know about it.
Yeah, it's in that case, it's probably sort of outside my field. I mean, there are like some, I guess, political philosophers that I'm aware of from like the 1900s, 1800s, but generally speaking, it's not a tradition that I'm very well aware of. Now, as for what is taught in British universities and other, I guess, sort of Western universities, I'm not sure. I mean, so certainly the general approach is analytic, and so if you so like within that tradition, there aren't a lot of Russian philosophers that like are brought up. I mean, so but like people do teach other things. I mean, and so I don't see why there wouldn't be some people teaching like Russian traditions of philosophy. It's not something that I haven't done personally a course in which we like specifically looked at Russian tradition in philosophy. But then I never did a course which looked at, say, a tradition of Indian philosophy. But there's certainly plenty of Indian philosophers. So not a field that I know about.
All right. Yeah. Well, we don't have analytical philosophers, I think, because the majority of them were anarchists. Those from 19th century, and then it's all Marxism and Lenin and all of this stuff. Yeah. And then can a schizophrenic be a philosopher?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Can a schizophrenic be a philosopher?
Oh, you mean like the mental illness?
Yeah. Did I pronounce it right?
No. Schizophrenic. I think.
I'm sorry. Schizophrenic.
That's okay. Yeah, I thought that. Well, yeah. I mean, there's no reason why not. Like, I mean, yeah. It's philosophy is just sort of, I don't know. It's just a kind of intellectual like discipline. There's no reason why people with mental illnesses shouldn't answer philosophical questions and answer them well. You know.
Okay. So the next question is, hello, dear guest. Have you read Russian literature? Maybe Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Goncharov. Do you know them? Have you ever? That is another question. Have you read Russian literature? Is what is what the person asked.
So I actually, and I mean, this is something I'm a little bit embarrassed about, but I don't really read any fiction at all. So I mean, you asked like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. The answer is no, because I don't read fiction, and the reason why is simply that I have to do so much reading just in like for my studying that I don't want to do it in my free time. Like to me, reading is work, and like I do a lot of it, and so you know I'm reading like philosophical articles and you know maybe other academic articles. I just in my free time I never want to read literature, and of course my own philosophical interests don't really overlap with like literature. You know, if you want to do philosophy of science, then again it's mainly like academic articles that you'll be reading. So as a result of that, not only do I not really read Russian literature, I don't read any fiction.
Yeah, that's
you know,
true.
maybe that will change in the future, but that's.
Yeah, me too. The last book I read was like 2 years ago or something. I don't read fiction too. Well, I'm talking about fiction. Yeah, the next question that is really bothering all of the people because it was asked 6 times. Have you ever heard of Alexander Dugin? What is your opinion on him? This is a continental philosopher. He's a radical traditionalist from Russia. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with his work.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. I have nothing to say about that.
That's okay. Получили свой ответ. So let's continue. The serious question. What does Kane think about social philosophy? Marx, Durkheim, and how do we call it? Marx and Durkheim and different topics such as feminism, for example.
So, what do I think about it? I'm not actually sure how to interpret that. Do you mean like what do I think of it as a philosophical field, or are you asking for my specific opinions?
Specific opinions.
Obviously, that's quite a big question.
Well, okay, no, it's not specified, but
yeah.
I think in general, have you studied it? Have you been interested in it? And what what social philosophers do you prefer? With whom you agree with?
Okay. So I was never really interested in that for quite a long time, and I mean during my my degree and my masters, I never took a course in political philosophy, which I guess is a type of social philosophy. So it was something that I never studied formally. I have more recently sort of become interested in this. It's again, it's not like within my field of expertise, but yeah, I mean, it's fine. It's interesting as a field, and I guess important. I don't know. Sorry, what was? I feel like I'm not sure if that's really an answer to the question. It wasn't something that I studied formally, right? But more recently, I have started exploring some of these topics. Maybe I should say that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And what do you think about maybe Frankfurt School, or I don't know how you call it in England, like the new waves of thinking? For example, third wave of feminism, and I don't know, critical race theories. Do you have a particular opinion on them? Or no?
I mean, not particularly. I don't know much about like critical race theory and stuff. I don't know. I don't feel like I have anything interesting to say about that. So I guess the answer would be no. Yeah.
All right. That's fine.
I mean, the thing is that it's like certainly with things like, you know, feminism and stuff. It's such a broad topic, and you know, I don't consider myself really familiar enough with it to just be sort of making, you know, broad pronouncements about it. Like there are, you know, there may be specific things I object to or specific things that I agree with, but yeah, it's something that I'm not really comfortable talking about given my current level of knowledge, let's say.
All right. The last question of the last question that I want to ask, but it is not for me. Is for right now is this one. What opinion do you hold on Nietzsche? Do you pronounce it that way? And his ethical opinions on ethics.
Again, Nietzsche's not someone that I'm all that familiar with, so difficult to say. I mean, I have read Nietzsche, and I honestly, it wasn't really for me. I didn't find it that impressive. I think that Nietzsche's a kind of I assume a kind of moral anti-realist. I think. I mean, is he? I think he is.
We can call it that way.
But I mean, so okay, maybe he's not. Like I say, it's not someone I'm that familiar with. But I mean, certainly he comes at it from a very different sort of perspective. I do have a friend of mine who says that Nietzsche took a lot of his ideas from Max Stirner, and I do like Stirner a lot.
He even got his. He sent. He has read all of his books, and a lot of ideas of Stirner have like flown to Nietzsche in some weird ways. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay then. In that case, maybe I would share that there would be some overlap in our views. Because I find a lot of Stirner's work very interesting. So again, that's not really an answer to the question, is it? But that's as much as I can say.
No, that's a great answer to such a question. As for now, I think we can return to some of my questions, and I want to ask you about philosophy of science, as this is a field you are this is a field you are studying currently, and you're preparing for your PhD in this field, as I think.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah.
What is I don't know anything about philosophy of science, as I am sorry to admit, but what is the mainstream in philosophy of sciences for right now, or is this field this young that it doesn't have a mainstream? It doesn't have a development at all?
Oh, I would say that it has. I mean, it has a pretty strong development. We can sort of identify, different periods in the history of philosophy of science. I mean, I think philosophy of science was quite significant in the development of like the whole field of analytic philosophy, insofar as both analytic philosophy and philosophy of science can sort of trace that I guess the kind of roots, well, maybe not the roots of analytic philosophy, but certainly a very important part of analytic philosophy was the logical positivists, and the logical positivists were primarily philosophers of science. Now, you asked what the mainstream is, or I'm not entirely sure what that means. Do you mean like the
maybe the main maybe the like we can say that physicalism is a mainstream theory in philosophy of consciousness, for example.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by saying mainstream in philosophy of science. Like the main theories that philosophers of science are dedicated to.
Okay. I mean, I think that physicalism is also mainstream among philosophers of science as well. So, okay, the mainstream. All right. Well, I guess what currently seems to be the consensus. I mean, there are lots of different questions in philosophy of science. It's a bit difficult to I won't go through them all. So okay, there is a very broad consensus. Just to take a topic that I'm interested in, there is a very broad consensus in favor of some sort of scientific realism. So scientific realism is, I guess, the sort of common sense view of science, insofar as scientific realism is the view that scientific theories are attempts to describe reality, and we are justified in believing that our best scientific theories do in fact succeed in doing this. So we're justified in believing that our best scientific theories successfully refer to entities out there in the world, and that those theories are approximately true. I mean, okay, they're not perfectly true. There are going to be things that we don't yet know. There are going to be mistakes that we've made, but they are, broadly speaking, true. So they're like, for instance, it really is true that the aurora, the northern lights, are caused by charged particles from the sun interacting with being caught by the magnetic field of the Earth and interacting with molecules in the Earth's atmosphere. Right, that is a true description of what's going on in the world. So most philosophers of science endorse some sort of scientific realism. There are lots of us, though, who are anti-realists, who will deny this. I'm an anti-realist, but that, I think, is a mainstream view. Another mainstream view, I think, would be some sort of anti-reductionism. So I think there's now a broad consensus that you know that we're not going to at any point reduce the theories of like biology and psychology and so on to being just theories of physics. But you know, there are lots of different things you might mean by that term. So yeah. Yeah, so there you go. Those are a couple of mainstream views.
And do you hold the same opinion, or does that or do you disagree with them completely?
Well, I'm very firmly on the anti-realist side. I think that what science does is so scientific theories, as I see it, should be viewed as instruments for systematizing, predicting, and controlling the observable phenomena. And I'm not prepared to believe that they are true descriptions of reality. Again, this is an expression of the kind of empiricist stance, right? So I want to try to account for the success of science without postulating like structures in the world of which scientific theories can be thought to truly describe. So yeah, I'm an anti-realist. I think most empiricists tend towards more anti-realist views of science.
Yeah. All right, thank you. How often do philosophers of science, well, the main opinion that I've heard about philosophy of science is that philosophers of science, their discussion is just around creating new fields and new sciences. And what things do they do besides that?
I'm not sure that philosophers of science. Oh, sorry.
No, nothing.
I'm an artist.
Yeah, I'm not sure that philosophers of science do create new sciences. Maybe
maybe define them.
That's how they would like to see themselves.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as I see it, philosophy of science. Well, okay, like there are broadly speaking. I mean, there are, I guess, at least two different things we might be doing if we're doing philosophy of science. So there are those philosophers of science who are kind of interested in contributing to science. So there are philosophers of science who will attempt to use philosophical tools to help resolve certain scientific problems. So maybe a good example of this would be something like within biology, there are a whole host of different ways of conceiving of what exactly a species is. So, you know, on one view, two organisms count as being members of the same species if they're capable of interbreeding. On another view, two organisms count as members of the same species if they occupy the same ecological niche. And there are like about 20 different, well, maybe 40. There's loads and loads of different definitions of species. And all of these different definitions do raise some difficulty if we're trying to understand things like biodiversity, which is often defined in terms of species richness. So there are problems within biology which seem to be broadly conceptual, which philosophers have contributed to. So there are some philosophers of science who are kind of, yeah, like they're using philosophy to engage with scientific problems. And another way of thinking about philosophy of science is we can kind of step back from science, and instead of trying to contribute to science, we can just say, we can just try to understand science like as an activity. So, what is the scientific method? Like how does scientific theory change occur? What are the scope and limits of scientific knowledge? What is the nature of scientific modeling? I mean, so there's all these questions like about science, and we're not really doing science when we step back and look at it. We're just doing philosophy, but we're like applying philosophy to the understanding of science. I think that I don't think philosophers of science really like create new theories as such, but I do think that you get some philosophers of science who are interested in understanding science, stepping back from it, and then there are some philosophers of science who focus more on like engaging with the nitty-gritty details of particular scientific problems. Actually, most philosophers of science usually engage in both, but those are the sort of two main things that philosophers of science do.
Yeah, thank you very much. It has become a little more clearer for me. So we have a question that isn't about philosophy of science, but it is about the next topic that I would want to discuss. The question is, Kane, do you have any opinion about free will problem? I'm sorry that we are jumping from one topic to another, but
It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, free will. Yeah, my take on this, I tend to be a compatibilist. So my view, is that I'm quite happy to say that humans have free will, but what I mean by that is just there are various capacities that normal adult humans have that seem to distinguish them in important ways from, say like animals or indeed inanimate objects like rocks. So, one of the things that we can do is we are able to reflect on our own desires and kind of overrule certain desires. So I have, say, the first order desire to eat chocolate cake. If I've got some chocolate cake in front of me, I want to eat it. But then I'm able to say, wait a minute, stop. Let's think about our long-term goals here. I want to remain healthy. I might care about my appearance, etc. If I just gorge on all the chocolate cake I'm presented with, then that's going to interfere with my long-term goals. So I won't do that. I overrule my first order desire in light of my longer-term desires. So we have that capacity. We have the capacity just in general, like rational capacities, the capacity to kind of to think abstractly, we have the capacity to think about moral constraints. Even if we're anti-realists, we can do that. So there's all these things that we can do, which I would say constitute a sense in which we are able to control our actions. Now, what you can say is, well, look, metaphysically, right? Obviously, all of your actions are a product of like the combination of your genes and environment. So you don't really have any control over that. And I'm like quite happy to accept that. Like, I mean, we have these capacities which are important. I would tend to call that free will. If you don't want to call it free will, then that's fine. I guess that's just a sort of semantic disagreement. But I guess the thing is that free will should be something that is important to us. I mean, like when people talk about free will, it seems like they have in mind something that is important and significant. And I think we can identify a whole bunch of capacities that normal humans have, which are important and which do which do justify a sense in which they have control over their actions. Again, though, it's not really, it's not to me all that significant if you disagree with that and say you don't want to call that free will. But that's my take on it.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I strongly agree with you on this particular topic, but I can't even imagine how can you take another position on free will, but yeah, because for example, United Nations, okay, yeah, I think that compatibilism is the most reasonable position that you can take. Well, there is another question. It's about yeah. Let me just ask it. What do you think of the article, "The Elimination of Metaphysics Through Logical Analysis of Language"? Do you have any critical... do you criticize it, or do you agree with it?
Oh man, it's been too long since I've okay. So this is not the way that I would eliminate metaphysics, but I don't know. I don't want to say. I can't say anything here. It's been too long. So yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Right. Hey, look. If you want to like email me about it, then you know, I'll have another read of it and maybe have something more to say. But I can't. I'm no good at like commenting on specific articles. As a matter of fact, you know, somebody once. I remember once doing like an interview thing, and somebody asked me about an article that I had written, and I'd written it like 3 months before, and I couldn't remember any of the arguments I gave in it. Right? So,
all right.
when it comes to these really specific questions, I'm no good. Not off the top of my head.
Yeah. So I think Thomas, our usual viewer, Thomas Windham, has asked it, and I think he could email you. Yeah, so just for Thomas Windham to know. He also asked, what are axioms in logic? What is a number? Should mathematicians care about philosophy of mathematics? Well, can you are you familiar with philosophy of mathematics? Or no, let me paraphrase it. Are you in can you answer something about it? For example, what is a number?
Yes. So with the question of like what is a number, I'm actually not sure. I haven't done enough philosophy of mathematics to have a clear opinion on that. Obviously, I would certainly want to reject Platonistic accounts of it, like, you know, views where numbers are like entities in a kind of, or like abstract entities that, you know, really exist in some other realm. But there are so many different accounts of what numbers actually might be that and I haven't done enough research on this topic to actually come down on any particular, you know, line. So I mean, so I would just say that just broadly speaking, you know, the way that I think about my broad philosophical stance is as a kind of, as I mentioned, it's more a kind of commitment, right? So although I am not perhaps capable right now of giving, say, an empiricist account of mathematics, I don't really see that so much as a challenge to empiricism as it is just an area which I haven't explored yet. I am pretty sure that Platonist accounts of mathematics go wrong. But I'm just not sure which alternative is right. So that's my answer. Yeah.
All right. And should mathematicians care about philosophy of mathematics? I don't know how can't they care about it, but nevertheless, what is your answer to it?
I don't have an opinion on whether or not they should care. I think mathematicians can get along perfectly fine just engaging in mathematical practice, right? Like there are I mean, I assume because actually I say this. I mean, I'm not a mathematician, but you know, I assume that they have like particular. I mean, when you're dealing with a mathematical problem, there are like particular rules that you have to follow, and there's a particular like practice that you engage in. There are standards for deciding what counts as a mathematical proof, and so on. I mean, you can do all of that, and you can just engage in that practice without thinking philosophically about it. I mean, the same is true, say, of science. I think it's entirely possible to be a good scientist and to think not at all about the philosophical problems that might arise in your discipline, because again, scientists, right, there are, say, particular rules that they're taught, particular methods that they follow. You can do that without thinking philosophically. Now, in terms of our like understanding of the field in general, well, I think we probably do need philosophers if you want to have a good sense of how it is that practice actually works. But instead of thinking of it like in terms of what should an individual mathematician do, is it useful just in general to have philosophers of mathematics? Well, yeah, because like we want to understand like what kind of knowledge is generated by mathematics, if any. Does mathematics successfully like describe mathematical entities? Does it get at mathematical facts, or is mathematics maybe something more like a kind of fiction, perhaps a useful fiction, or does mathematics describe structures and patterns in the empirical world, and so on and so on? If we want to know the answers to questions like that, you've got to do philosophy of mathematics.
Yeah, and I think that in my personal experience talking to people, I don't know how what is the general opinion about philosophy in other countries, but in Russia, a lot of people and a lot of scientists almost despise philosophy, saying that it is something that we shouldn't care of. That philosophy is something is a thing from the past, and now the science is what we should study, and philosophy is something that you talk about with a cup of tea in some cafe or something. But I think it comes from not they think of philosophy that way not because they're stupid or something. It's just because they don't understand what philosophy actually is, and that is the problem, because philosophers don't always know what philosophy is. Yeah, but it is certainly important. It is certainly very important.
Yeah, so I mean, philosophers, as I suppose was demonstrated when you asked me what philosophy is, we're not always that good at explaining what the subject is. But I don't know if we necessarily have to do that. I mean, I think that it's probably good enough just to do philosophy and just show, hey, these are some interesting questions, and we've got useful ways of thinking about these questions, and this is what philosophers are actually doing. But yeah, so I mean, over here it's I think much the same, right? Like there's a lot of people who think that philosophy is basically a waste of time, and that like any kind of interesting question that you might think of as philosophy, really that's just something that's been overtaken now by science, or by other disciplines. I mean, I actually think that in some way, I mean, so maybe in some cases that's true. There have been philosophical questions which have moved over to science, but also the development of science has itself created new philosophical problems. So I don't. Well, obviously, I don't agree with that way of looking at philosophy. I think philosophy has, first of all, it has a lot of practical. It does have some practical utility.
Yeah, ethics, for example.
There are. Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, if like, presumably you care a little bit about like the political system in your country. Well, you're going to have to be engaging in philosophy if you want to critique that. Within my field, philosophy of science, the simple fact of the matter is there are philosophers who have contributed to the development of sciences in their philosophical work. Like there are philosophers and scientists who work together on problems. I mentioned the case of the species problem. Like you can find articles written by philosophers and scientists working together on that. So it is a fact that philosophy has practical utility. And it's also the case, I would say, that we shouldn't judge everything just in terms of its, like, I don't know, instrumental use. We don't kind of, if we're doing art, say, you wouldn't sort of say, well, like, okay, but how are we going to use this art in order to like build useful technology or something like that? It would be a strange way of looking at things.
All right, and yeah, and thinking about art, do you have a certain position on on aesthetics? Do you feel like it is well, it is something objective, or is it just something that or is it any person's deal?
Well,
Whether
I don't think that like aesthetic value is objective. No, I think it would be a bit odd to be a moral anti-realist, but then like
Yeah.
I'm an artist. I'm a
aesthetic
performance
realist.
artist.
It'd be a strange, like, to think that it's an objective fact that like this painting is good, right? But slavery, no fact of the matter about that. That's like, that would just be odd. I mean, I don't know. There are probably some philosophers who do hold that opinion, but it would be strange.
Yeah. And that yeah, that was certainly a stupid question.
Well, no, not a stupid
Returning
question, but
returning to philosophy of science, what positions do you hold about the philosophy of biology? Does a population exist? Population is something real or something nominal, in your opinion? Nominal. Yeah, it's nominal.
No, I don't think that there are like real populations. I think that what we do, so the way that we draw the boundaries around populations, we draw like whatever boundaries happen to be useful in terms of the construction of particular predictive models. So so for example, right, if we are thinking about, like, if we're trying to construct, say, selective models, right, like models of selective processes in populations, then you might say that then you're going to need to in order to identify any kind of process of natural selection, right, you have to have a collection of individuals, right? There has to be more than one individual. There has to be a whole collection of individuals, and you know, we need to be thinking.
Стрим упал. Выпало, Андрей. Okay. Is everything?
Hello.
Can you hear me? Oh yes. Something has happened. Okay. I have to do something.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Can't see you.
All right. There is a problem that I can't solve. Yeah. Oh no. I think I have to ask for help. Okay. Yeah, I have to. Oh no, I'm sorry. There's some problem. My camera died, I think. Камера выключила. Чат, вы меня можете слышать? Okay. My camera has died. And that's why you're alone on the screen right now. Okay,
well,
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I can still hear you.
Okay. Okay, so let's continue.
Okay, do you want me to just shall I just go on with what I was
yes.
Do you want to just carry on?
Yeah, I'm
okay,
sorry.
Okay. Oh god, I've forgotten where I was in answering that question. All right, so look, populations, yeah. So there is a just a kind of general, if we're thinking about natural selection, say, there's a kind of general schematic law or schematic model that we apply in lots and lots of different contexts. So we would say something like, if individual A is fitter than individual B in such and such environment, then individual A will probably have more offspring than individual B. And so that's a sort of schematic law, and then we fill it in with the details of a particular population. So we'd say, you know, if this moth is darker winged than this moth in the polluted forest, then probably like first moth will have more offspring than the second. Once you get a specific model like that, you can then test it, right? We can then do some empirical research and figure out whether or not it's true that the darker winged moths have more offspring than the lighter winged ones. Now, if those specific models are falsified, you don't reject the sort of general evolutionary law, right? Like if it turns out that darker winged moths actually have less offspring than lighter winged moths, you wouldn't say, oh, well, you know, it turns out that like like natural selection is falsified. Instead, what you do is you just generate a new model. So again, using that schematic law of if individual A is fitter than individual B in a given environment, then probably individual A will have more offspring than individual B. You take that and you just generate a new model. And there are all kinds of ways you might generate new models. You might look at different traits. So rather than talking about, you know, darker wings and lighter wings, you might pick out a different trait, or you might define the population differently. So the individuals that you pick out as being like, okay, so where are you picking out if we're talking about moths, right? Are we going to pick out individuals from, you know, this part of the forest, or from this broader part of the forest, or from the forest as a whole? You know, the population, the biological population, as I see it, is just, right, whatever is useful in terms of constructing these kind of models. And that's just the case if we're talking about like natural selection. Obviously, there are many, many other questions that arise in biology that might require us to define populations. But as I see it, the population is just, it's not something that's like objective. It's just up to us where we draw the lines, and we draw the lines where it happens to be useful. That's my take on it. So hopefully that answered that person's question.
Yeah, I think that it is a very broad answer to the question. Thank you. Yeah, I think the camera has returned. Now you can see me.
I can't see anything.
Okay. All right. Whatever. There are a lot of questions. Another question. What are your views on social ontology? For example, nations. Do you have a particular opinion on that?
I haven't studied that topic, although, yeah. So, no, I'm afraid I don't.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Returning to empiricism. There's a question. What do you think about Hume's bundle theory of consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think it's something that I'm very sympathetic to. It just insofar as, so my take on this is that, you know, we choose where to draw the lines with different things, right? It is there is a lot of practical utility in kind of drawing the lines as we do, in thinking of people, right, as being. So when I think of, you know, what constitutes personal identity, I think of it as being something that is like tied to this body over time. So like, you know, my personal identity is just a matter of whatever like mental states and so on occur in connection with this body as it changes over a period of time. I don't think that, you know, there's any sort of, you know, underlying substance or anything that like unifies that, or at least if there is, I mean, it's something that we have absolutely no access to, and it therefore can't play any role in our use of phrases like I and self. And it, you know, because ultimately, right, when we use this kind of language, our language is based on things that we do actually have access to. All that we have access to are, you know, bodies and the properties of bodies and the all of the kind of the messy and confused mental states that that we're sort of subject to every day. And so, you know, we just draw lines that we find useful on that basis. So in that sense, it's a position I'm sympathetic to. I tend to think that the boundaries of like personal identity are a purely pragmatic matter. Yeah.
But wouldn't it be the easiest explanation that of why do we separate certain things some particular way? Of course, if we talk about populations, not even about social structures, why do we separate some populations one from another? Maybe just because they are different, and we've just recognized it. Wouldn't it be easier than just saying, well, or more reasonable, saying we just don't know, we don't have the right criteria. Well, we base our knowledge about different populations, even for pragmatic reasons, or on some different criteria that we make. And if we don't have a particular set of explanations for why a certain population is a certain population, that criteria, then why wouldn't we use it to just say that there is a concept of population? And no, I think that I didn't make my speech that understandable. I just can't. I can rephrase it if you want.
Yeah, maybe if you could rephrase that. Is this back? So is this now in reference to the point about biological populations?
Yeah, biological populations, but also just about different distinctions that we make, even in social ontology. Well, we have some different criterias for our distinctions. For example, how can we draw the line between one population and another population? Well, we have to have some criterias. And why can't we say that those criterias are actually the ones that we can use to say that different populations exist? Because A, B, C, D, the ones that we use for pragmatic reasons, why aren't they just why don't we use them for even for not pragmatic reasons? I don't know how actually say that.
Well,
properly.
I mean, I don't actually agree that there are any clear criteria for determining what counts as, say, a population. So I see there are, as I see it, there are a whole bunch of different population concepts, let's say, and the right population concept to apply is just whichever one happens to be useful in the construction of predictive models. And bear in mind as well that when we construct models, it's our models are not just going to be attempts to reflect, say, the way the world is. We also want models that we can actually use, right? So because we have all sorts of cognitive limitations. Good models, certainly within science, will provide us with they're tools that that make things understandable to us, that allow us to unify lots of different phenomena in a way that we find intelligible. Now, as I see it, there are all kinds of things that you might mean by the term population, and again, the right sort of population concept to apply, it's like the population doesn't come first. Predictive models come first, right? And so there just isn't like a population concept that we should agree on. And I would say the same about, say, the right concept of individuality, right? Whether that's biological individuality or personal individuality, like personal identity. I don't really think that there is like a concept of these things that we sort of all agree on, as it were.
Yeah. So there are models, but those but they do not certainly represent reality from your point of view.
They may represent parts of reality because, you know, if, for instance, we have a model that we can use to make predictions, and assuming that those predictions are true, that is just to say that the model does accurately represent things that we can observe. But when we talk about, like, so even in the case of things that we can observe, like I'm very much a nominalist. Like, I think that we have to draw the lines. We have to kind of determine under what conditions we will count a particular, say, two objects as being the same type of thing, or under what conditions we will count an object as bearing a certain type of property. So, for instance, I say that the table in front of me is flat. Obviously, you know, it's, if you zoom in, there's going to be all sorts of bumps and ridges, but it's flat enough because I can put my relevant objects on it. You know, I've got the computer on it, I've got the cup on it, I've got my phone on it, and they don't wobble, they don't slide. So, okay, for my purposes, the table is flat. So it has the property of flatness. But of course, as I say, really, if you want to speak strictly and you zoom in, then the table isn't flat. And actually, no table that has ever existed would be flat, because there will always be, you know, you're never going to have a perfectly flat surface. So, yeah, how we group objects together and the conditions under which we take objects to bear properties, I think that there is a significant constructive element to that.
Yeah. And what do you think about the nature-nurture problem? Is there does such distinction even exist in your opinion?
No, I don't think so. I think that so first of all, I mean, every trait is a product of the interaction between genes and environment, and I think that when we talk about, like, so this distinction between nature and nurture can be used to refer to a whole host of different things. So, like, we might, when we talk about a particular trait as being a product of nurture, let's say, we might mean that this is, I don't know, not an evolutionary adaptation, or we might mean that it's not universal, or we might mean that it's not, say, the something that a trait that the organism it is like developing towards in a kind of normative sense. There are lots of different things that we might have in mind, and I'm inclined to say, in any given context, you should just avoid talking about nature and nurture and instead be more specific about what it is you actually have in mind. Like, if you think that a particular trait is an adaptation, well, just say that. I mean, if you think that a particular trait is universal, just say that. So that's my take on this. I would be inclined to break that concept down into its constituents.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and what do you think about geographical determinism? In the case of human development,
I don't really have any opinion on it. I'm not that familiar with it. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is another question, and it is about consciousness. From Thomas Wyndham. If consciousness is an illusion, so what do we mean by dreams? Is it you that having dreams while sleeping, or somebody else?
I don't think that consciousness is an illusion.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I no, yeah.
Okay.
I'm not. If the people who do think that consciousness is an illusion, I'm not sure what they would say about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure too. I can't read that. Another question: How does what is your opinion about continental philosophers? And what is your favorite continental philosopher, if there is one?
I don't do continental philosophy.
Continental.
So
yeah, it's continental. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay, continental.
Yeah, I don't do that. It's not. I mean, I would have studied it in a couple of courses, but I always, to be honest, tried to avoid it because it just wasn't something that I found that interesting. So yeah, I don't know. Does Stirner count as a continental? I think Stirner was around before that distinction made any sense. Although I think he's been more influential among continentals than he has certainly among analytics. So that's as close as I've ever come really to studying continental philosophy. Right, is somebody who was around before that distinction even existed. Yeah, yeah. No, I'm my tastes are perhaps quite narrow when it comes to philosophy. I'm very much a product of the analytic tradition.
Yes, but I think that's great. Well, we wouldn't invite you if if you were a continental philosopher, because I don't know. It's hard to understand them in Russian, and it is even harder to understand them in English. There wouldn't be a discussion at all. Yeah, another question. Well, it's a set of questions. Why do we trust epistemological testimony? Why do intuitions make propositions true? But I don't know, like, you didn't say it, but okay. Are contemporary philosophers obsessed with intuitions, or okay, are contemporary philosophers obsessed with intuitions or arguments? I don't know. Okay. Well, the first one is, why do we trust epistemological testimony?
That's phrased in an interesting way, because why do we trust it? I'm inclined to say would just be a sort of a psychological question, right? Like, I mean, like, hey, why is it that humans do this sort of thing? In terms of like, are we say justified in trusting testimony? I think that the majority of our knowledge is based on testimony in one way or another, and I think that in order to so just from a purely practical point of view, right, in order to get by in the world, you have to make distinctions between people. You have to be able to identify certain people as experts in particular contexts. Like if I experience some sort of funny sensation in my body, I go to a doctor, and I am probably going to trust what they say because I identify them as an expert. If I've got some problem with the plumbing, I get a plumber because they're an expert. So if you were to try to imagine like living in the world without identifying certain people as reliable sources of information, with doing away with testimony, I think that would be kind of, well, it would be self-sabotaging. You would become unable to achieve a lot of your goals. And I think that that kind of just purely pragmatic sort of vindication is as good as it gets in epistemology when it comes to overcoming skepticism. So, yeah, I haven't studied philosophy of like testimony in any great detail, so I don't have any specific like theory of the conditions under which we can trust people's testimony. But I do think that there are very, very, very good reasons to rely on testimony, generally speaking. So that was the testimony question. And then there was a question about intuitions, right?
Yeah. There was a question, well, why do intuitions make propositions true? But I don't know who said that. Who said
I don't
that?
think that. Yeah, I'm not sure that intuitions would make propositions true. I mean, I suppose that you can state a proposition about intuitions, which would be made true by intuitions. Like if I say most people have the intuition that such and such, well, that would be made true or false by intuitions. But no, in terms of like interesting philosophical propositions, it's not that intuitions make them true, but what a lot of philosophers will say is that intuitions are like reliable guides to the truth. So just think about what we would say about perception. I say that there is a cup on the table in front of me. Now, there is a cup on the table, right? I believe that on the basis of my perceptual content and on the basis of like what I'm visually perceiving. That proposition is not made true by my perceptual content. It's made true by the way the world is. It's just that my perceptions,
correlate,
we assume,
with,
are
yeah.
a reliable guide to it. So it's what a lot of philosophers will say is they'll say the same about intuitions, that intuitions are a reliable guide to facts in certain domains. Now, personally, I'm extremely skeptical of intuition. So, this isn't something that I necessarily would say. But I think that's the common view.
Yes, that's quite common that certain intuitions can correlate with with what we would call a right position, right philosophical position. Any arguments against epistemological nihilism? This is the question.
What is what do we have in mind by epistemological nihilism?
Nihilism. I don't know. Maybe the radical rationalism. The question is in English, so I didn't even translate it.
Okay, I don't I'm not sure what epistemological nihilism is.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah. All right. I'm skipping some of the questions. Yeah, this one was quite expensive, so I shall read it, but I'm not going to translate it, please, because it's it's a bunch of words. Я просто Иван из города Тверь, и я интересоваться, великий лемон, густой шевелюра, сильный стример, смотреть Кейн, сильный, слабый. Ой, хотя... Нет. I won't read it. I'm sorry. Yeah. I can't continue with saying pronouncing it. Right. Let's get back. More personal questions. I think we will. Well, it's not like super personal, but just about your maybe path to philosophy. And I think we will end with this because 2 hours have passed, and I think my computer will die. We will take some time more. Well, how did you came to philosophy? How did you come to philosophy? When will you? Why did you start studying it? And what was your motivation?
I can't remember. So yeah, I know that I did philosophy when I went to university. That was what I wanted to do for my degree, but I can't actually remember why it was that I chose philosophy. I know that when I was a kid, it's not something that I was like always really interested in, because I know when I was a kid I wasn't that interested in philosophy. At some point around the age of 14, 15, 16, maybe, I think I just started thinking about philosophical questions. Or maybe I realized as I was studying subjects in school, like I did psychology, maybe I just thought that the more philosophical questions related to that were the ones I found the most interesting. The thing is that I really don't have a very good memory for my past. I tend to be somebody who just sort of lives, in the moment. I don't have any clear plans for the future either, actually. I tend to, think about like what I have to do in the next week, and that's as far as my mind extends, either, forwards or backwards. I'm not, I don't remember much about what motivated me to become a philosopher. I know that the reason why I continue to do it is just because I find it fascinating. I don't think I need any other reason than that. But God, I really don't know. Yeah.
All right. What? But do you remember what? Maybe what field fascinated you most, and maybe as for right now, what is the branch of philosophy that you find the most maybe interesting and exciting? Maybe a part
I think
of
that
yeah, okay, continue please. I'm sorry.
I think that when I first got into it, I was mostly interested in philosophy of mind. And I think that I drifted away from philosophy of mind because I came to the view that a lot of the questions were just totally irresolvable. And I found myself I just didn't know what to think about it. And so because I wasn't really able to defend a particular position, there was no position that I was happy with. It wasn't really that fun. What I do now, well, I've mentioned, I focus mainly on philosophy of science. Although, to be honest, I've been focusing mainly on philosophy of science for long enough now that I'm kind of ready to move on to other things. So I don't know if it's the topic that excites me the most. Like, yeah, I did my dissertation on my degree. Was philosophy of science. Most of what I studied in my master's was philosophy of science. My PhD is philosophy of science. It's all philosophy of science, and I think I'm ready to move on. So yeah, it's. I still love it, but it's just like I have found myself getting don't know. I'm finding myself wanting to think about other things.
Yeah, and maybe what field do you want to get into as for right now?
Well, the great thing about philosophy is that you can just cover so many different things that you don't really have to choose something specific. You know, I suppose that, look, I mean, I will always, if I'm successful at becoming like an academic, then I imagine I will always focus somewhat on philosophy of science. I'm also very, very interested in meta-ethics. I have definitely gotten more into meta-ethics. I mean, just over the last couple of months, it's something that I've always been interested in it, but it's just, you know, I really want to get my teeth into it again. So that's what I'm looking at the moment. But I haven't really got time right now, actually, because I'm coming towards the end of my PhD, so I've sort of got to focus on that. But yeah.
The main focus of our channel is it wasn't intentional, but right now it's meta-ethics.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a lot of content about it, and we are trying to I don't know, enlighten people about it. It's a very interesting, exciting field. Okay. Maybe the last question will be will be totally unrelated to everything we've discussed, but can you name 2 films that you recommend and 2 directors that you enjoy the most watching?
Well, that's difficult because I don't know what the taste. I mean, if I'm recommending something, it depends on the tastes of the person I'm recommending it to. So it's, you know, like, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, also, I don't actually watch films much these days, mainly just because films are sort of too long. I like to watch. If I'm watching something, I'll usually do it when I'm eating, and I find that, like, a television episode, if I'm watching TV, it might be, you know, 45 minutes to an hour. That's enough time for me. With a film, it just sort of goes on too long. So yeah, I don't watch a lot these days. My favorite film is 2001: A Space Odyssey, and but I don't know if I would recommend that because, I mean, that's like, there's a lot of people who would not enjoy that. So, you know, whether I recommend it would depend on the taste of the person I'm talking to.
Yeah, and many people have already watched it. I think that is a
Exactly.
very
Yes,
popular
it's a very.
movie.
I mean, if you're the kind of person who would probably like that movie, then you will have already seen it. So, yeah, yeah. I really, I don't know. I don't.
Okay.
If I was going to recommend a film, I'd need to know more about the person's taste. But honestly, if you want film recommendations, I'm not the person to come to because I don't watch many films these days.
Maybe TV shows, as you mentioned.
The only TV show that I really watch is Doctor Who, particularly the classic series from 63 to 89. Although I do like the modern show as well.
Yeah, I've dropped it a couple of years ago, but yes, this was a phase. Right, thank you.
Oh, for me, it wasn't a phase. It's yeah, since I was like 9 years old. It's been my favorite show. So
yeah, well, it's not something that we see on TV regularly, so that is something you should look for. All right, I think we have come to an end of of an interview, though it was kind of all over the place. But thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your answer, for your profound answers. I really
Thanks for having me on.
I really appreciate it. As for our viewers, спасибо вам огромное. Спасибо за милый чатик. И будем ждать вас еще. Подписывайтесь на канал Кейна Бейкера. Ссылка, конечно, есть. Если вы еще не подписаны, то я не знаю, что с вами не так. Спасибо большое всем за стрим. Спасибо большое, что донатили. I think we can end our translation. Yeah, so our live stream. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.